The hotel room was a masterpiece of expensive, lifeless minimalism. 30 floors above the rain, slicked streets of Chicago, the air conditioning hummed a low, metallic note that felt like it was vibrating inside my teeth. I had just finished the most important presentation of my 32 years. My throat was dry from talking through 3 hours of projected growth and market expansion, but I was proud. I was the stable one. I was the one who could be trusted with $1 million budget and a room full of skeptical executives. I had built this life brick by brick, mostly by proving that I never needed anyone to hold the ladder for me. I sat on the edge of the crisp, white duvet and reached for my phone, expecting a congratulatory email from my boss. Instead, the screen flickered with a notification from my home security app. Motion detected. Living room. It was 7:30 in the evening back in Seattle. My house should have been a tomb of quiet, undisturbed air and the soft scent of the jasmine candles I had lit before leaving. I opened the app, expecting to see a glitch or perhaps a neighbor's cat through the window. Instead, my living room was flooded with light. I caught my parents on my security camera planning to move my brother into my house while I was on a trip. My father was holding a tape measure against the bay window, marking out space for what looked like a gaming desk. My mother was standing in the center of the rug, her arms crossed, nodding with a terrifying sort of domestic authority. I watched, frozen, as my father pointed toward the hallway that led to my private office. He said something I couldn't hear, but then my mother laughed. It was a light, melodic sound I had heard 1,000 times at Sunday dinners. She leaned in toward him, and her voice came through the tiny phone speaker with crystalline clarity. Once everything is here, she will not make a scene. She will just accept it. Mom said it with such casual certainty that it felt like a physical blow to my chest. So I set a trap for them and enjoyed the cold, sharp realization that the version of me they knew was already dead. The betrayal didn't arrive as a scream. It arrived as a sudden, freezing silence in my blood. I watched them move through my sanctuary, my mother running her hand along the back of my velvet sofa, as if she were already deciding which thrift store to send it to. They were acting like owners. They were treating my life's work like a vacant lot they had every right to colonize. I had spent my entire adult life believing the lie that if I was successful enough, if I was helpful enough, if I was the one who always answered the phone at 2 a.m. to pay for my brother's latest disaster, then I would finally be respected. I thought my utility was my value. I thought if I stopped being the solution, I would be abandoned. But looking at the screen, I realized I had already been abandoned. They did not see the woman who had clawed her way out of their chaos. They saw only a safety net. They were counting on my shame. They were betting everything on my desire to keep the peace, and my pathological fear of making a scene. My mother knew me so well, or so she thought. She knew that I would rather swallow glass than have a loud argument in a driveway. She was banking on my silence to give my brother, Leo, the life he hadn't earned. I didn't close the app. I sat there in the Chicago dark, watching my father drag a heavy box of Leo's old high school trophies across my hardwood floors, leaving a long, pale scratch in the finish. The sound of the box scraping reached me through the phone. A harsh, grating noise that signaled the end of my patience. I didn't call them. I didn't scream through the two-way speaker. I simply leaned back against the headboard and opened my laptop. My hands were perfectly steady. I was the stable one after all, and it was time to put that stability to work. I began to plan. I began to calculate. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care about being loved. I cared about being whole. I would let them move the furniture. I would let them carry the boxes. I would let them believe they had won right up until the moment the floor vanished from beneath their feet. The trap wasn't just about the house. It was about the truth. I closed my eyes for a second, imagining the silence that would follow when I finally stopped saying yes. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I didn't wait for morning to begin the dismantling. The blue light of the laptop screen was the only thing illuminating the hotel room, casting long, ghostly shadows against the walls. I felt like an investigator at a crime scene, but the victim was my own future. I opened my bank portal and began a deep dive into the last 5 years of my life. The digital trail was a map of my own weakness. One line at a time, I started a spreadsheet. I titled it The Cost of Peace. The first entry was from 3 years ago. $2,500 for Leo's first month of rent and a security deposit on an apartment he swore would be the launchpad for his tech startup. He had promised to pay it back in 90 days. Instead, he had asked for another $500 for the electric bill 2 weeks later. I typed the numbers into the cells with a rhythmic, mechanical click of the keys. As the list grew, a hollow ache formed in the center of my chest. There were transfers for emergency car repairs that never seemed to fix the car. There were payments for high-end camera equipment he needed to become a content creator. There were countless dinners, utility bills, and even a $3,000 legal retainer for a dispute he had started with a former landlord. Each transaction was a moment where I had chosen to be the stable one instead of the respected one. I had been paying for my own invisibility. I paused, leaning back as the total at the bottom of the screen updated. $85,422. That was not just money. That was time. That was years of overtime, missed vacations, and the constant, low-level stress of ensuring my own accounts never dipped too low while I was propping up a grown man. A sharp memory surfaced, cutting through the cold data. I was 10 years old, standing in the doorway of my bedroom, while my father moved my desk into the hallway. He told me that Leo needed a bigger space for his drum kit, because he was going through a phase of creative discovery. My mother had patted my cheek and told me I was so mature for my age, so helpful. That was the day I learned that my space was negotiable. But Leo's whims were sacred. I had been living out that same 10-year-old's trauma for 2 decades. I looked back at the security feed on my phone. My mother was now in my kitchen, opening my cabinets and rearranging my spice rack. She moved with a casual, terrifying confidence, as if my home were simply an extension of her own property. She didn't look like a guest. She looked like a settler. I realized then that my house was more than a building in Seattle. It was my fortress. It was the only place in the world where I didn't have to be a daughter, or a sister, or a safety net. It was the physical manifestation of my escape. And they were currently trampling through it with muddy boots, convinced that because I was quiet, I was also hollow. The realization brought with it a shift in my internal temperature. The paralyzing betrayal of the previous hour began to crystallize into a hard, cold resolve. I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to dismantle the entire system of entitlement they had built around me. I reached for the hotel phone and called the airline. I moved my flight to 5 a.m, which gave me just enough time to arrive before the evening rush. Next, I opened a search engine and looked for the highest rated junk removal service in the greater Seattle area. I scheduled a pickup for that same evening, timed to coincide with the moment Leo usually started his evening live streams. I typed in the address of my home with a steady hand. Under the instructions for the crew, I wrote 3 words: remove everything unattached. Finally, I searched for a locksmith. I needed someone who could change 10 deadbolts and code a digital garage door in under an hour. I wanted the house sealed by sunset. I sat there for a long time, after I finished the bookings, listening to the Chicago rain lash against the window. I wasn't the daughter they remembered. I wasn't the girl who would just accept it to avoid a scene. I was a woman who knew exactly what her peace was worth, and for the first time in my life, I was prepared to collect the debt. I closed the laptop, the click of the hinge sounding like a gavel. Tomorrow, the performance would end. Tomorrow, I would finally go home to a house that was actually mine. The cabin of the airplane was a hum of white noise and recycled air, 30,000 feet above the dark stretch of the American plains. Outside the small, oval window, the world was a void of blackness, but inside my mind, every detail was illuminated with a sharp, neon intensity. I had spent the last 2 hours staring at my phone screen, watching the silent movie of my life being dismantled. The Wi-Fi signal was just strong enough to refresh the security feed every few minutes. Leo was there now. I watched him through the wide-angle lens of the living room camera. He was wearing a headset and pacing back and forth in front of a ring light he had set up in the corner of my dining room. He was gesturing wildly, his face twisted into that practiced, high-energy grin he used for his followers. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged there. My mother walked behind him, carrying a stack of my guest towels, and she smiled as she watched him work. It was a domestic tableau that should have been sweet, but to me, it felt like watching parasites under a microscope. I felt a vibration in my hand. A text from my mother popped up on the screen. "How is the trip, sweetie? We are so proud of you." I stared at the words until they blurred. "We are so proud of you." It was the same phrase they had used to keep me in line for a decade. It was the sugar-coated bribe they offered in exchange for my silence. They were proud of my paycheck. They were proud of my stability. They were proud that I was successful enough to be exploited without it ruining me. I didn't reply. I couldn't. Any word I sent would have been a warning. And I wasn't ready to tip my hand. I needed them exactly where they were: complacent, arrogant, and settled. I turned off the screen and leaned my head back against the thin, airline pillow. My heart was a steady, heavy drum in my chest. I wasn't scared anymore. The fear of their disapproval, which had governed my choices since I was a child, had finally burned away, leaving behind something cold and structural. I thought about the word family. To my parents, it was a debt that only I was required to pay. To Leo, it was a limitless line of credit. But as the plane banked toward the Pacific Northwest, I redefined it for myself. Family was supposed to be a sanctuary, not a hunting ground. I looked at the flight tracker on the screen in the seat back in front of me. We were 200 miles from Seattle. 200 miles from the end of the version of me that just accepted it. The descent began, the plane dipping into the thick, gray clouds that always seemed to hug the Puget Sound. I felt the pressure change in my ears, a physical manifestation of the shift happening inside my soul. I wasn't just landing in a city, I was landing in a new reality. I checked my bag one last time, making sure the folder I had titled "The Cost of Peace" and the contact information for the locksmith were ready. The stable daughter was gone. The woman who was about to walk through front door was someone they hadn't met yet, and I realized with a grim sort of joy that they were going to hate her. As the wheels touched the runway with a sharp jolt, I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for years. The taxi to the gate felt like an eternity, but I used the time to verify the appointments I had made from the hotel. The junk removal crew was confirmed for 6:15, strategically after the livestream was set to peak. The locksmith was scheduled for 7. Everything was in motion. I stood up as soon as the seatbelt sign chimed, my movements precise and deliberate. I walked off that plane with the weight of 1,000 concessions falling off my shoulders. The storm was coming to Seattle, and for once, I was the one bringing it. The taxi dropped me off 3 blocks from my driveway. I didn't want the sound of a slamming car door or the sweep of headlights to alert them. I needed to see the scale of the occupation before I breached the perimeter. The Seattle evening was damp, a fine mist hanging in the air that turned the street lights into blurry halos of amber. As I walked toward my house, the quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by a low, rhythmic thumping. It was bass music, heavy and invasive, vibrating through the sidewalk and into the soles of my shoes. I stopped at the edge of my neighbor's property, shielded by a thick cedar hedge. My house, which I had designed to be a sanctuary of shadow and soft light, was blazing like a film set. Every window was a bright, unforgiving square of white. In the driveway, 2 cars I didn't recognize were parked at haphazard angles, blocking my garage. Though I knew the junk removal trucks would have something to say about that later. I had already called the towing company to clear the path for the Debris crew. Strangers moved in and out of my front door, carrying light stands and silver reflectors. It looked less like a home and more like a commercial soundstage. I felt a surge of nausea followed immediately by a searing heat in my chest. This was the violation I had seen on the screen, but in person, the smell of it hit me. I could smell the exhaust from the idling cars and the faint, greasy scent of cheap takeout. A delivery driver on a moped pulled up to the curb, carrying a thermal bag, bursting with $200 worth of high-end sushi. I watched as he walked right into my house without knocking. He didn't need to. The front door was propped wide open, with one of my decorative stone bookends. I looked at my phone, checking the credit card alerts. My mother had used the emergency card I gave her for her heart medication to pay for the feast. It was a small, sharp detail that hurt more than the furniture being moved. It was the casualness of the theft that stung. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore, because they were so certain I would never have the courage to look at the bill. I saw Leo through the large picture window in the living room. He was surrounded by a group of 3 or 4 young people, all of them holding phones on gimbals, circling him like he was a sun they were orbiting. He was laughing, tossing his hair back, performing a version of a successful man that was funded entirely by my labor. He looked so happy. He looked so proud of himself for standing in a room he didn't own, eating food he didn't buy, telling lies to people who didn't know any better. I stood there in the mist for several minutes, letting the anger settle into my bones, until it felt like a structural part of my skeleton. I wasn't the daughter who would come in and apologize for being late to the party. I was the person who was about to turn the lights off. I pulled my coat tighter around me and checked my watch. It was nearly 6 o'clock. The violation was complete, and the evidence was undeniable. They had taken my space, my money, and my silence. But they had forgotten that I still held the keys to the world they were pretending to live in. I turned away from the bright, noisy spectacle of my front yard and headed toward the side gate. I had one more piece of the puzzle to collect before the main event. A shadow was waiting for me near the garage, a woman named Sarah, Leo's former partner, who held the one thing that would ensure Leo could never lie his way out of this again. I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the wet grass, ready to exchange my old life for a truth that would burn the whole house down. The side gate creaked with a low, rusted groan as I stepped into the shadows of the side yard, away from the blinding theatrical lights of my own living room. Waiting there, tucked against the cedar siding, where the rain dripped from the eaves, was Sarah. She looked smaller than I remembered, her face pale under the amber glow of the neighbor's security light, but her eyes held a hardness that matched my own. We had not spoken in 2 years, not since Leo had convinced me that she was the unstable one, the one who had tried to ruin his business with her jealousy. I approached her, the rhythmic thump of the bass music from inside the house, feeling like a dull headache behind my eyes. Sarah didn't waste time with a greeting. She held out a thick, yellow envelope, the paper damp from the mist. She said she had been waiting for the right moment to hand this over, but she hadn't realized I was actually out of town while the circus was being set up. I took the envelope, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled out a stack of documents. They were lease papers for a luxury sport utility vehicle, a car I had seen parked in my driveway minutes ago. I flipped to the final page and felt the world tilt. There was my name, printed in neat, block letters, and beneath it, a signature that looked almost exactly like mine. But I knew the curve of my own capital K, and this was a frantic, shaky imitation. The date on the contract was 3 months ago, a week after I had given Leo a loan for what he called a branding workshop. Sarah whispered that it was not just the car. She told me that he had used my identity to secure a line of credit for his production equipment. And when that was not enough, he had gone after our parents too. My heart went cold. I asked her if they knew. Sarah nodded, her voice barely audible over the music. She said they found out a month ago, but Eleanor had begged her to keep quiet. They didn't want to crush his spirit, while he was so close to a breakthrough. They chose to let him commit a felony against their own daughter, rather than admit their son was a thief. The fury that had been a slow simmer since Chicago suddenly flared into a white, hot flash of clarity. It was not just about the furniture, or the spice rack, or the sushi. They had sat at my table, looked me in the eye, and watched me work 12-hour days while knowing my name was being used to fund a life of luxury for a man who had never held a real job. My parents were not just enablers. They were accomplices in the destruction of my credit, my reputation, and my safety. I looked at the house, the bright windows now looking like the eyes of a monster. I told Sarah to stay close, to wait by the side door, and watch the live stream on her phone until she heard me address the room. I wanted her to be the final witness, the one person who could verify that the golden child was nothing more than a common fraud. I tucked the envelope under my arm, the weight of the evidence feeling like a weapon. I was no longer the daughter who was mature for her age. I was a creditor coming to collect. I walked toward the back entrance, my footsteps heavy on the wet stones. I was done being a safety net. It was time to become a net for the truth. And I was going to make sure no one escaped the fallout. I entered my house through the kitchen door, the air inside thick with the smell of expensive truffle oil and the humid heat of a dozen bodies. The bass from the speakers in the living room was so loud it rattled the glassware in my cabinets. I stood in the shadows of the pantry for a moment, watching the scene. My dining table, a hand-carved piece of walnut I had saved for 2 years to afford, was covered in cardboard sushi trays and half-empty bottles of sparkling water. My mother was standing by the refrigerator, laughing as she poured wine for a girl who couldn't have been older than 22. The transition from the cold, wet night to this fever dream of a party was jarring, but I didn't hesitate. I walked into the living room. The transformation was total. My velvet sofa had been pushed against the wall like a discarded prop. In its place stood 3 industrial-grade ring lights, their white glare blindingly bright. Leo was in the center of the room, standing in front of a backdrop he had taped over my favorite gallery wall. He was holding a gimbal, mounted phone, his voice projection hitting that professional, manic pitch he used for his audience. He was telling them that this house was the result of 3 years of grit and strategic investing. He was telling 5,000 live viewers that he had built this sanctuary from the ground up. My father stood off to the side, his chest puffed out with a tragic, reflected pride. I felt a wave of cold, crystalline fury wash over me drowning out the last remnants of my desire to be the stable daughter. I walked directly into the light. I didn't stop until I was standing 2 feet from Leo, my shadow falling directly across his face on the camera screen. The room went quiet, the music cutting out as someone near the speakers noticed the look on my face. Leo's smile didn't just fade, it curdled. He tried to keep the gimbal steady, his eyes darting to our mother, then back to me. He muttered into the microphone that his sister had just dropped by to celebrate. I looked directly into the lens of his phone. I told the 5,000 people watching that it was a beautiful house. But it was a shame the person talking didn't own a single brick of it. I said my name clearly. I told them I was the owner. I was the one who paid the mortgage, and I was the one who had just returned from a business trip to find my life being sold as a lie. Leo's face went from pale to a mottled, angry red. He hissed at me to get out of the shot, that I was ruining the vibe, that I was taking this too far. My mother rushed forward then, her hands outstretched, as if she could physically push the truth back into the shadows. She whispered that we should go into the kitchen, that we shouldn't embarrass the family in front of Leo's friends. I didn't move. I felt the weight of the yellow envelope in my hand, the forged signatures and the stolen credit lines. This was the lowest point, the moment where the stable daughter was supposed to break and retreat to save their reputation. But the ghost of my childhood, the girl who had given up her room and her peace, finally went silent. I realized that my family's reputation was a burning building, and I was no longer willing to stand inside to keep the walls up. I turned to my father, who was looking at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. I asked him if he knew about the luxury car in the driveway. I asked him if he knew that his son had forged my name on a $50,000 contract. The silence that followed was heavier than the music had been. It was the sound of a decade of lies finally collapsing under their own weight. Leo tried to laugh it off, telling his followers that I was just stressed from work, that I was prone to dramatic outbursts. He was still performing, still trying to salvage the grift, even as the foundation turned to sand. I reached out and took the gimbal from his hand. I didn't grab it, I simply took it, my movement so deliberate that he didn't even fight me. I held the camera up, so it pointed at the yellow envelope I was opening. I told the audience that since they liked success stories, they should see how this one was funded. I began to lay the documents out on the coffee table. One by one, under the unforgiving glare of the ring lights. I showed the forged signatures. I showed the bank statements. I showed the reality of a life built on the back of a sister, who was supposed to just accept it. The high stakes of my life, my credit, and my home were all on the line, but as I looked at my mother's horrified face, I realized I wasn't losing anything. I was finally winning myself back. The glare of the ring lights was blinding, transforming my living room into a sterile operating theater, where the truth was finally being dissected. I stood over the coffee table, the forged documents spread out like evidence in a courtroom. Leo reached for the phone, his face a mask of desperation. But I stepped back, keeping the camera lens focused on the paper trail of his betrayal. The comments on the live stream were scrolling by so fast, they were a blur of white text. A digital audience witnessing the precise moment his manufactured world turned to ash. My mother stepped forward, her voice a sharp, frantic whisper. She told me to stop this instant, that I was destroying my brother's future over a few pieces of paper. She said we were family, and that family meant protecting one another from the world, not feeding each other to it. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel the familiar pull of guilt. I told her that she had stopped being my protector the moment she allowed Leo to steal my name to fund his fantasies. I told her that by protecting his lies. She had become an architect of my ruin. The room was deathly quiet now. The influencers and hangers, on who had been drinking my wine and eating my food, were backing toward the door, their phones held up to record the spectacular crash of a rising star. My father remained by the wall, his face gray and sunken. I turned the camera toward him. I asked him again if he knew. He didn't speak, but his silence was an admission. He had known about the car. He had known about the credit cards. He had simply decided that my ability to absorb the loss was worth more than his son's integrity. That was when the side door opened, the one I had left unlocked for her, and Sarah walked in. She did not look at the cameras or the shrinking crowd. She walked straight to the table and dropped a second envelope next to mine. She looked at my parents and told them they should check their own mail. She revealed that Leo had not just targeted me. He had opened 3 separate lines of credit in our father's name, totaling $40,000, to cover the losses from his failed crypto venture 6 months ago. She said the default notices were already being sent to their house. The shift in the room was violent. My father's phone buzzed in his hand as if on cue. He looked down at the screen, his eyes widening as he scrolled through a series of urgent alerts from his bank. He looked at Leo, not with the indulgent pride I had seen my whole life, but with a sudden, sharp terror. He whispered that Leo had promised everything was under control. Leo backed away, bumping into one of the lights and sending it crashing to the floor. The glass shattered with a sound like a gunshot. He started to shout, a high, panicked sound, saying he was going to make it right, that he just needed one more month, one more big deal. He looked at me and begged me to turn off the camera, to tell everyone it was a joke. I looked at him and felt nothing but a profound, exhausting pity. I told him the time for making it right had ended 3 months ago, when he picked up a pen and signed my name. This was the moment everything collapsed. It was not a grand explosion, it was a quiet, terminal disintegration. The truth had nowhere left to hide, and the people who had spent decades living in the shadows of my hard work were suddenly exposed. I took a deep breath, the air in the room finally feeling clear of the truffle oil and the lies. I looked at my mother one last time as she tried to grab my arm, and I told her that the scene she was so afraid of was finally over. I was not accepting it anymore. I was ending it. I turned off the phone and handed it back to Leo. The screen was black, the audience gone, leaving him standing in a room full of broken glass and strangers who no longer cared about his name. I told everyone who did not live there to leave within 5 minutes. I told my parents that they were no longer guests in a home they had tried to steal. The high stakes had been settled, and as the house began to empty, I realized that the only thing I had truly lost was a burden I should have never agreed to carry. The silence that followed the departure of the last stranger was more than just the absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a vast and cooling ocean that rushed in to fill the spaces where the bass had thumped and the lies had echoed. I stood in the center of my living room, watching the tail lights of my parents' car fade into the misty Seattle night. They had left without an apology, their faces set in masks of indignant betrayal, as if I were the one who had violated the sanctity of our bloodline. I walked to the front door and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The click was final, a sharp punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very exhausting chapter. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and simply breathed. For the first time in my adult life, I was not waiting for a phone to ring with an emergency. I was not bracing for a request that felt like a demand. I was not calculating how much of myself I could afford to lose just to keep someone else from failing. I turned back to the room. It was a disaster. The ring lights were gone, leaving behind skeletal shadows where they had stood. The air smelled of stale perfume and cold fish. I began to move, my actions slow and deliberate. I picked up the empty bottles and the cardboard trays, carrying them to the kitchen. I stripped the backdrop from the wall, revealing the quiet gray paint underneath. I moved my velvet sofa back into its rightful place, the heavy legs groaning against the floor. Every inch of movement was a reclamation. Every straightened cushion was a boundary restored. I thought about what my mother had said in the hotel room. She had been right about one thing. I had accepted it for a long time. I had trained them to treat me as a resource, rather than a person, because I was terrified of the very silence I was currently enjoying. I had confused endurance with love. But as I wiped the last smudge of Leo's finger, paint success from my coffee table, I realized that true love does not require you to disappear. The house did not feel empty. It felt inhabited by the person I had been before I started apologizing for my own existence. I went into my office and sat at my desk. The room was dark, save for the streetlights filtering through the jasmine vines outside. I opened my laptop one last time and saw the final report from the locksmith. The codes were changed. The digital perimeter was secure. I looked at the spreadsheet I had created in Chicago, the one I had titled The Cost of Peace, totaling $85,000 of my life. I didn't delete it. I saved it to a folder labeled History. It was an expensive lesson, but the deed to my own soul was finally back in my hands. The consequences for Leo and my parents would be theirs to face alone. For the first time, I was not stepping in to soften the landing or negotiate the fallout. I felt no guilt, only a profound and steady peace that sat in my marrow like iron. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, the stairs no longer creaking under the weight of an uninvited family. I lay down in the dark and listened to the rain tapping against the glass. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, a lullaby for a woman who no longer had to be the stable one for anyone but herself. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 32 years, I slept in a house that was entirely mine.